Welcome to the Express Boats State of Waterfowl podcast series, presented by Gros Savon Lodge. Join our host, Doug Miller, Executive Operations Manager at Gros Savon Lodge, wildlife biologist and passionate waterfowler, along with co-hosts, world champion duck caller Jim Ronquest and conservationist Kason Shore. State of Waterfowl is designed to provide you, our audience, with data, valuable insight, and information gathered from our guests that will allow us to scientifically determine the state of waterfowl, the health of our resource. We understand that the most valuable asset that we have is our resource, and that is waterfowl. Without them, we do not have a season, commerce, purpose. Join us today as we dig deeper into what is the state of waterfowl.
All right, guys, welcome to another edition of Express Outdoors State of Waterfowl series. If you guys were with us last episode, we had Doug Osborne with us. He's the associate professor there at the University of Arkansas at Monticello, and we were talking about banding operations that he's got and all the cool things he's going on there at the university. And there was just so much to talk about in one episode, we decided to invite him back. So, Doug, welcome back to State of Waterfowl series.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with y'all.
Well, good. You know, I see Jimbo, you've made it back from Fort Worth. You were over at the DU Expo all weekend. I hope that went well.
It went as well as it could have, I think. Thank God the wind was blowing. All that blacktop and that big racetrack, sun shining, was warm.
I would imagine it got pretty warm over there. So, Kason, I see we got you with us today. Glad you could be with us and step aside from your rice farming duties today. You probably glad to come in out to heat too for a little bit.
The air conditioner's never bad.
That's right. So let's go ahead and get this thing kicked off. I know we could talk forever with Doug. You got some really cool information. Kason, why don't you throw out a question and let's kind of pick up where we left off after the last episode.
Yeah, one of the things that's really been on my mind since we last spoke, you know, Doug, we kind of got into hen mortality rate with the transmitters. And I know kind of talking a little bit 2 years ago with Paul Link, some of the units that we got out just got clobbered over the summer, sometimes up to almost 3 times the mortality rate that's factored to AHM. And I'm sure you can shed some light on that. You know, maybe a lot of them because they're marked birds. It could be any number of other factors. But I wanted to know, you kind of mentioned it, but tell us what you're seeing. What's it looking like on your side?
Yeah, we have a couple hundred mallards with transmitters on them, and the hens have taken a beating this summer for sure. But again, you got to remember, you know, I don't know what it is. You know, we got a couple things going on. One, we had that big, huge ice storm, and birds left in poor body condition. We had some pre-storm body condition information, post-storm body condition information. These birds lost 15 to 20% of their body weight. And so we had hens that went back in poor body condition because of that ice storm that was so late in the winter. And then 2, they go back to the breeding grounds with low wetland density, you know. Relatively dry up there. We're actually seeing a lot more movement of our transmitter birds early in the breeding season on the prairies than we have in the past. Some birds that overshot the prairies and then came back. And so I don't know if that's a function of them bouncing around looking for water, going somewhere where they thought there was water last year and then get there and there is none, and then they move. And so, you know, poor body condition, low density of nests or wetlands. And then, you know, we got a pretty high mortality rate on our transmitter birds. So it's a little bit disturbing. It's definitely higher than it was last year. But there's a couple of, you know, things that come into play there. But, you know, low wetland density, and you know, I haven't worked that much on the breeding ground, but just my understanding of it is that we get low wetland density, we just concentrate everything. You know, we concentrate the birds, we concentrate the predators, they know where to look. And so, you know, in my opinion, without working a bunch on the prairies, just maybe they're just more susceptible when the wetlands are, you know, wetland density is low up there. So they're taking a hit for sure. And it's a little concerning, I think.
Yeah, that's you got to go ahead, Casey.
I was just going to ask if he had seen any any interesting evidence of multiple attempts at nesting. We've seen some of that, with low density. As far as wetlands, you see birds that will try time and time and time again. And then you had, like this previous fall, we had a really early freeze in October up there. So you've got some late molting birds that are still in the nest. Are you seeing any evidence of that with your birds?
Yeah, we definitely see it. There's a good couple handfuls of birds that have nested a second time. And so, who knows? The hen mortality is the one thing, and then also nest success. And so, fortunately for us, they got enough time sometimes to take a couple cracks at it, and hopefully they can beat the system on the second round. But there are some birds of ours that are, that are nesting a second time now. And I haven't talked to, I haven't looked at the data, or talked to my students in a couple of weeks about what the situation specifically is with them now. But last I knew, there were definitely maybe 12 or 15 birds on a second nest. So it's pretty good. Mm-hmm.
Not bad. Talking about nesting, and you've seen a lot of movement, ducks shooting past the prairies and coming back. Do you have any birds nesting up in the boreal forest?
We have, yes, real close to the edge, several. And interestingly, the last few years too, we see a lot of the drakes even will, they'll be in the prairies, the nest with the hens, and all of a sudden they take off, and it seems like they're always going to the boreal. So when I first started these transmitters, I was actually surprised, just from my lack of working in the prairies a bunch in the past, is how many of these birds are actually right on that edge of the boreal, or even into it a little bit. But there are a couple of hens on the edge of it. Yeah. If I remember I believe a couple of our birds that are nesting, the last couple that I looked at I think they are further west than north even this year than maybe they were last. So, but it's, everybody's sometimes concerned about the transmitter effect, right? And is it the transmitter? Is that why they die? And so if you think back at the ice storm, I always thought, man, we had quite a few birds die. And I thought, man, these transmitters will kill them. And we go out there and we find a pile of dead birds, it's teal in a ditch that tried to survive. We may have talked about this last time, but it at least made me confirm that it really isn't just the transmitter that's killing these birds. And so I think there is some effect that we need to maybe take into consideration, but it's not specifically that extra weight that's really harming their mortality. It's increasing mortality. And I don't think that's the case.
Gotcha.
If it really was that big of a deal on mortality, I think at some point we'd probably need to stop putting devices on these things. But
circling back a little bit on the boreal forest and nesting and drakes moving up there, you always heard forever on these dry years, and it's, as I understand, it's as dry as it's been in its 1980s dry, 1980 dry on the prairies up there right now. And you always heard how important the boreal forest is to keep some sort of production happening. I wonder if we got any data to back up just how many ducks are produced from that part of the world and how big a reduction in production we get on these dry years, like a percentage between a really wet happening year on the prairies. And of course, the side note to that is the importance of those prairies have to dry out at times to be productive.
Yeah, that's a good question. I just, I think the beauty of the transmitter project over time here is that we can start to look at that, right? And so we got Paul Link's birds, we got the Tennessee Tech Brad Cullen's birds, transmitters, and our birds. And so if we can make this transmitter project even bigger scale regionally, and do it through time for a few years, we can start to pull out, I think, some of that. We see wet years, we got a bunch of hens out there, we see where they nest, how productive they might be. And then, we compare those to other years like this one that we're seeing now. And so I specifically haven't talked to Brad or Paul yet about the birds that they have marked and where they're at and how they're doing and all that. But I suspect if we can get a, 5, 6, 7 years of data on this, and we get some variation in those wetland conditions through time, I think we can start to get at some of those questions. But you think as adaptive as a mallard is, right, that they're just not going to not nest. I mean, sometimes they don't. I mean, they don't on these types of years, but hopefully they're adaptive enough, with the variation in the precipitation across the landscape. We've seen it a few years ago with our harvested birds. So all the birds that were banding down here, that 2018-19 year where nobody could kill, consistently harvest birds. But when I plotted the harvest data, it was just a big blob across the upper Midwest and down here. Whereas all these other years, it's patchy concentrations of where the bands are being harvested. And so because there was water everywhere, right, they just scattered everywhere. And and so you think, they've adapted to their migration on a southern migration route, that they're hitting all these other spots because there's available water and available food everywhere else. So you think and hope that, they would take more advantage of the boreal, although they're traditionally not really nesting in there. So,
Doug, I know you actually participate in the Flyway Council meetings, and the fact that we're going into the second year of no data on the breeding grounds because of the COVID issues. Does that concern you as a manager with the compounding of a drought and what all's going on? Are we reacting quick enough in regulations as to continuing our 6 duck 60-day seasons?
That's a great question. And just try to be careful not stepping on anybody's toes answering this question. But we had a pretty good email chain going across the Athlon listserv. It's a waterfowl listserv, which are waterfowl biologists. And one of the guys that's adamant about banding data says, as long as we got banding data, we can still make these, we can still come up with these estimates, and we can still make adaptive decisions that are science-based. And so, yes, we don't have the aerial surveys. Yes, we don't have the ground truthing surveys to validate the aerial surveys. But as long as we keep putting the bands out there, those bands will give us estimates of harvest rate, reporting rate, survival rate, and distribution of harvest. And so there's lots of people that are very adamant about banding and the data that it gives us. And so really, really, really neat analysis just came out by a guy from Fish and Wildlife Service. And he's done a two-season banding analysis where they're banding on the breeding ground and in wintering ground, and learning finally how to use the winter data to inform those estimates of survival and harvest and all that. But before, even now, Fish and Wildlife doesn't include the winter banding data into their models. And so I think if we keep seeing gaps in survey data and we get all these gaps, we're going to have to learn, I think, how to use this winter banding data to fill in those knowledge gaps and to fill in those estimates in those years. And I think we're getting to that. Aerial surveys are super expensive. They've already shut down the Whitefront survey, on the Alberta, Saskatchewan fall aerial survey that they've done for 20, 30 years. They're not funding that anymore because they realize, the utility of banding data and what it's given us and how good those estimates are. So they're starting to go away from, at least in that one case, going away from aerial surveys. And, who knows if we get if it keeps becoming an issue trying to get up in an airplane to count these birds and to do the surveys that they're canceling this year again, who knows? It may be another paradigm shift where we're pushing into a bigger banding efforts to provide that, that data that we need. So we'll see how it goes. Yeah, it's interesting because, last year's cancellation affects 2 hunting seasons down the road. And so this last hunting season was already set in place, right, from the previous year. But now that there's a second year, last year's data was supposed to inform this year's harvest decisions. And so now they're, scratching their head. And I'm not sure exactly how they're going to go about making those decisions. But, they just got to use all the best available data that they have. We know there's errors in the data and there's some biases and limitations to some of it, and they just got to make the best, decision that they possibly can. And so hopefully don't go on a third year. They may be trying to figure out how to make change.
Doug, you mentioned there that you mentioned that the winter banding numbers or data that you're collecting is not being used in some of these models. So I have to ask, but based on some of the Lincoln Peterson estimates, we're not banding anywhere near the number of birds that we should be, and a lot of that's a funding issue. You kind of talked about it. Do you think that some of this winter study is going to start being used, or should it be?
Yeah, it definitely should. And I think, that's why this started, really. In the 90s, people were harvesting 5-6 bands a piece. They were putting out, 40, 50,000 bands in a breeding season. And now they're putting out, I'm catching almost as many birds sometimes as they do on some of the sites up there. And it's just, this is a one-man show down here. So if we could get if we can figure out from this 2-stage analysis that the Fish and Wildlife just done, if we can figure out the utility of that and how it actually, the limitations to it and how that'll fill in our estimates of harvest and stuff, I think we can move forward by doing the banding that they've been doing on the breeding grounds and down here. Collectively, these data should provide, we can ban, just we're banning 4,000 or 5,000 mallards a year just in 15 or 20 days, just from my crew alone. So if we could get some help from the Game and Fish Commissions on a couple of different states, and I think we can have a real impact on getting the numbers and the sample size we need for those Lincoln Peterson estimates. And it's a data hungry model, so it needs lots of bands. And so, I think we're getting there. We're 7 years. I just looked at the analysis today. We're running a survival analysis, and we're finally now getting enough. We're 7 years or so into this banding program. So now we're starting to generate some estimates of reporting and recovery rate and all that stuff that is going to see how, informative our data is to those models. And so I think we're moving towards that. It's a slow process. Research is slow, but my focus from now on or moving forward from here, I know that we have a good bit of data. We got 7 years of data. So we're going to start to generate these estimates and see how well they match, that's being generated from preseason banding data. And then we're going to move into that 2-stage analysis. I think collectively our data will be used. I really do. I think it'll be a while. The adaptive harvest management stuff is built on preseason data. So all that structure of how that works internally with the Fish and Wildlife and all that stuff's going to have to change if they do ultimately decide to adopt this 2-stage, modeling approach into that. And so that stuff doesn't take time to make, policy decisions on that. And so, but it's gonna come down to the guys that are doing the winter banding to justify and demonstrate that these 2-season survival analysis and harvest rate analysis are really informative to that model, and then change will come. But it's going to take a little time.
You mentioned there, kind of before I asked that question, you mentioned the cost of aerial surveys. I've heard some other guys kind of talk about that. If the states would stop investing so much in aerial surveys, that funding these banding sites would be pretty easy. Now, I know as a hunter and Jimbo too, a lot of people live and die on that midwinter survey. Where are the ducks? Are they here? It's big news. But from your perspective, would it be beneficial to stop some of the winter surveys and invest more in research on banding?
No, I don't think so. I think some of the states that have been consistent with their surveys and that have, that their survey routes are consistent and their trends through time is very important data. I definitely don't encourage that. I'm with you on that. I love seeing those reports. From me being on the ground, sometimes I'm scratching my head when I see them, and I'm like, is that really where the concentration was? And there's variations in those surveys, but I think the trends of those surveys are really important. And so the states that have that have had a stronghold that's maintained those surveys and maintained the funding for those surveys should obviously, keep doing it until we demonstrate that, there's a better way. But, to have those sort of mid-season sort of understandings of how population, winter density sort of shift around the landscape I think it's important for states to, in regulating especially regulating like public land use and all that sort of thing,
Interesting stuff. Do you have any, talking about your telemetry studies and winter movements, can you tell much based on public versus private and age class of those birds? Can you tell if there's an age class difference between birds that are staying on the sanctuaries versus an age class that might be using more public woods to hunt, or rice fields that's got a pit in them, as you mentioned earlier? Can you tell anything with that?
No, mostly because most of that's in the experimental design. One, we're catching mostly adults because we're catching them before the hunting season starts. And so that's mostly, most of the time it's over 90% adults at that point, right? We're catching them in early November, before the season starts. And so we're finding these clusters of adults for the most part. So I've not really incorporated the juvenile and adult sort of comparison in there. So I don't think I can really answer that. In terms of the private land versus the public land, most of our devices at this point, we put a good bit out on one land. But I'm going to say most of them have been put out on public. And so this year, though, we're picking up 2 big private land holdings, and we're going to continue on that we started last year. So this year, we're going to have 3 areas that'll have one in the Bayou Meta Basin, one up north of Augusta in that area, and then the other one over down around Des Arc. And so we're going to put out a good bit of devices on private land this year. And so I think we can start to get at some of that. Public land is really interesting, though. We have a lot of devices on public land. We have a really good understanding of their movements, and these birds are. They surprise me how little that they're moving into public hunting area. We're putting them on an area that's got wood, sanctuary, timber, and then woods, and then huntable woods. And these birds are really staying on the sanctuary during the day for the most part. But it's a large tract of ground, and so the information we're trying to get out of this is how do we use these data to inform the development and the creating a waterfowl complex, right? That's what we're going to, is how do we build a complex that can hold birds, and that these birds are going to move in a direction in which they can scratch out their limit, on a regular basis. So we're trying to use the data on public land really to better help hunters. That's what I'm trying to do. So hopefully we can learn how to say, hey, we probably should, maybe you could use, you could add some sanctuary habitat here and allow this chunk to be hunted. And so from the movements of the birds, we may be able to better inform the layout of this wetland complex in terms of what you can and can't hunt, to hopefully, increase, the likelihood of the hunters to encounter these birds. And so we're hoping to help redesign, because, historically you think about a lot of the, the rest areas are on the outskirts of the timber or on the outskirts of the hunting area, right? And so if that's the case, sometimes these birds aren't moving, over the woods as much. And so anyway, we're thinking that this can really, with some simulation analysis and stuff that we're going to plan to do, we're really hoping that this can help us think about the design of a wetland complex and what it should look like, so that we can encourage more duck movement from one area to the next, and that the hunters can be, have an opportunity to harvest some. So we're excited about that. It's, we're probably a year out from that, but that's where we're hoping to go with some of these data.
Got you. Do you see kind of the same kind of movements birds on private sanctuaries versus public sanctuaries? You see this kind of the same deal?
They honestly, I think they seem to move more on the public or on the private sanctuaries, because I think they're, the public sanctuaries, it's sanctuary all year, right? The birds are there. It's the private, you got a bunch of sanctuary one day, and then the hunters are set up in X and Y holes, right? And then the birds get acclimated to some area, and then the hunters move, and then the birds go to where the hunter was yesterday. And so I feel like that's what we're seeing more on the private lands that's a little relatively bigger complexes. The birds are more shifty and they're moving around, but they do stay within a relatively small area. That's another thing that we're really starting to look at here, is like, how much land space do these birds use, and how many times do they sort of, these sort of local movements on the farm and versus like relocation movements to other regions and stuff. How much of that are we seeing? Those are sort of things that we're starting to look at as well. I feel like the birds on the public are staying on the public in that smaller area. The birds on private are moving or relocating a little bit more frequently. And they also within that farm or within that land holding, it seems like they move a little bit more as well. And I think maybe that's because of the dynamic of the hunters moving and the pressure that they're seeing on public land. But
Doug, do you notice any of your birds going nocturnal when that pressure gets turned up?
Yes, nocturnal. Even historically, we think about just the full moon deal and they go nocturnal. I don't think that's the way the mallard duck thinks anymore. I think they're feeding a lot at night.
They're just sounds like all this is in relation to responding to pressure. Pressure is the big deal.
Yes, sir. I absolutely think so. Like I said, a lot of my birds are, especially on the sanctuaries, on the public grounds, they're in the timber on the sanctuary during the day, loafing, doing their thing, and then at nighttime, they're sitting in the rice field that the guy was hunting all morning, right? And then the guy goes in with a ranger in the morning and flushes all these. Oh yeah, the ducks are here. The ducks are here. It's going to be a good hunt. And then they go hunt, sit in their blind, and they harvest 2 shovelers. So, but the birds are utilizing the habitat that's out there. They're using the rice fields. There's energy there to gain. They're using them, but they're using them at night. They're roosting on them. So a lot of my birds on the refuge are actually roosting on private land at night.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. So one of the things I was wondering about, forever, you always thought over here, if you're on the prairie and you got a flood coming down the Cache and White in overbank flooding, it's always thought of that the prairie birds move to the bottoms. One, can you see those movements? Could you base that back on the calendar and weather event if you've seen them birds move from, say, the prairie to White River or Cache River Basin? Or a lot of times think they go north and follow the water down. Along with that, is there a correlation there between disturbance and where those ducks go?
The answer is yes, I can figure that out. And the answer is, do I have the answer yet? No, I don't. Yeah, so I think we can look at that. We can time those sort of relocation movements, is what I call them, right? If they go from the prairie down to the White River bottom or Cache bottom or whatever. So we can look at that. That's obviously something that we can think back. And actually, that's a little bit of that. We're starting to look at precipitation and stuff. Starla's doing some of that work, and Ethan Dittmer is working on some birds as well from White River area that he may end up plugging in some of that. Some of that flood data or precipitation information into some of his models as well. But I'm not sure I can answer that question with the data that we have now, but just sort of anecdotally and just from what I've heard, and there's so many more people in the region that know these birds move way better than I do, just from hunting them all their lives here, But of course, I've heard that a lot as well. But thinking back of some of these major relocations, we've had some birds out of the White River area even move into the Bayou Meta Basin. And it seemed like when they moved, there was more than one. A couple of them, a handful of them would move at once. And so something triggered them at that point. I just wonder if it was some sort of, new habitat created by flooding, as you're talking about, or something like that might have triggered them. So that's interesting. Like I said, I don't have the data for it, right? I mean, I think we have the data. I just have something we'll have to look into.
That'd be pretty interesting. I think it's real, but you could back it up and say, okay, we got the data now to support that hypothesis.
That's the beauty of these transmitters. And with Paul Link stuff and Brad Cullen from Tennessee, I think in a couple of years, we're trying to answer a bunch of our local questions now that got these funding. But I think in a couple of years, we'd start pulling these information. And I think the sky's the limit on some of these questions that we can start to get to. And by talking to you guys and talking to my buddies in the duck blind, when they have, these questions get written down, I said, these are things we've got to start to look at. And so we got a whole list of them. We'll have an encyclopedia of questions by the time we got 4 or 5 years of data. So that'd be great.
Another one on movements, and I know Doug's got a question too, but while we're kind of on that subject, when you talk about relocation movements, as that maybe back out into migration on some of your earlier transmitters, this may kind of come back to site fidelity, but do you see a lot of birds that say you got them, you're pinging them in the upper Midwest, say they're in the Dakotas or Nebraska? Can you kind of see, are their movements more really big movements to their wintering grounds, or are they leapfrogging down? And some do different. I know some go one way, but can you see kind of a correlation there on your birds?
I've had more, and again, and this may go back to what cohort of birds I'm catching or what kind of group of birds I'm catching, but we're catching in early November before the season starts, because we want winter data. And so that group of birds is ones that may just be coming here, skipping country and coming right on down. And so what I've seen is big movements for the most part. We'll catch a few. We got a few birds that do some leapfrog southern migrations, but for the most part, they're pretty big movements that we've seen on a southern migration now. On a spring migration north, it's the opposite, though. We do see a lot more of that leapfrog, and it's probably sampling, right? Food sampling, looking for the bugs that they need or those proteins, especially on the hens and those drakes that are following them. And so, it's definitely more leapfrogging up. And we've seen that with white fronts a few years ago. And Paul Link and y'all probably know this better than me, but I went to the Arctic and marked white fronts in Alaska on the North Slope and up in Nunavut, Canada, above the Arctic Circle. We marked white fronts, and those birds went from the breeding ground to the prairies, the Canadian prairie. They stayed there for 30 days, and then they went all. They didn't land again until they got to Arkansas. So they did that big leap as well. And then on the northern migration there, they're tippy-toeing up and hitting Illinois and the Boot Hill, Missouri, and going across. And so they're conserving energy, right? And so you think about that, the breeding birds, the fall birds, they leave out relative, they get healthy, they make big jumps. They get down here, they know there's a bunch of food, there's rice, there's a bunch of food where they can build their energy back up. But on the way north, they need to conserve as much energy as they can so they can find the food that's been eaten on all winter and that they, so I think it's an energy conservation type thing on the way north, that they need to conserve their energy until they know they find the resources that they need. And so it's an interesting dynamic with body condition and their health and, and the behavioral decisions that they make in terms of how they migrate. So, but those fall migrations for the ones that we mark now, for the most part, have been pretty big southern movements.
I think Paul Link and Brett are doing some work down here in South Louisiana, blue-winged teal, and they saw some of those big jumps. I think they had blue wing leave Canada and come all the way to Louisiana and then jump all the way down to South America. You know, it's amazing how many miles they could travel in just a couple of days.
Yeah.
That kind of leads me into another question. I know this is kind of deviating a little bit, but all of the discussion that we've been having, mostly the banding and the telemetry, has been associated with mallards. And, you know, traditionally a mallard is not quite as prevalent down here in South Louisiana as it is for you guys in Arkansas and Missouri area. And we've always wondered, you know, why don't we do a lot of studies on some other species? And I think you mentioned last week that you may be doing some work on, is it green-winged teal and Weegians?
Yes.
Can you just give us a little recap on what kind of study you are doing and what do you what's the goal to get out of that?
Yeah, the goal really is we're putting backpacks on Weegian, green-winged teal, and mallards on the same unit, and really the goal is just to learn the different life history strategies, you know, the differences in these migration events, decisions that they're making on the wintering ground, how they use the wintering ground, you know, habitat selection, those sort of things. Because again, we always talk about the mallard, we always compare, you know, all the harvest regulations are really off the counts, for the most part, off the counts of mallards. And so starting just to think about, you know, the differences in these life history strategies of these birds, so we can maybe provide some species specific recommendations in terms of, you know, habitat or harvest management stuff is really where we're going with that. And so this project is funded by Delta Waterfowl, and we're working with those guys on this here. We'll be marking birds again this year as well, here on the wintering grounds. And so again, it's just, you know, as y'all might realize, we're learning that the Weegians aren't, you know, they're eating the vegetation off the, you know, they're spending a bunch of time in weedy ag fields, you know. So if we're out there with clean ag fields, you know, with just a little bit of sheet water on it, but no weeds, then that's no good for the Weegian. But, you know, the weeds are okay. And so these guys are just spending all their time grazing. It's neat to see it on the data, how different they select habitat relative to the teal. And so, again, some of my colleagues in Alabama have tried to mark gadwalls before, and we may be starting to see this with Weegian, but the gadwalls just don't accept the backpack very well. Like even if you get the weight way down on it, it's just like they cringe, like they got something on my back, I can't move, you know, type thing, and they don't. It's a behavioral thing that I just don't think they had very good luck with trying to mark gadwalls. And we in Delta we were all interested in that because of South Louisiana's importance. You know, the gadwall is important to Louisiana and teal. And so that's what we tried to add that species in there. But it was one that just has trouble taking a backpack, and these guys just hunker down and they don't move right. And we know that it's impacting their movements way more than a lot of these other species. And so gadwall was one on the list that got axed just because of that. We want to make sure we're getting sound data. But the Weegian are a little similar, but we had some transmitter issues on Weegian this last year, or the first year. The transmitters failed us, and then we put some on there we put a bunch on this last year as well. We had a little bit more mortality on there. The transmitters did a lot better. But the Weegians, I think, if it wouldn't have been for the ice storm, we would have had a lot better response out of the Weegian. The teal are tougher than nails. You put a cement block on the back of a green-winged teal, and that sucker's going to fly away. But anyway, we're putting these little 10 gram. These things are only 10 grams we're putting on these teal, and they fly off like rockets. It doesn't seem to, you know, affect them. And of course, Paul Link's put them on blue wings, and he's probably seen the same thing. But those guys, pound for pound, I think the Greenwings, what we found so far is the Greenwings are a lot tougher than Weegian, pound for pound. So,
well, I know I'm really excited to see the Greenwing information. You know, that's a duck down here that's I call them filler ducks for your limit. We kill a lot of them, and in fact, the last couple of years that was one of our number one species harvested. So it's been kind of funny to see how we some years we haven't seen the big flocks of them like we do in the past. So I know when we were up in Arkansas 2 years ago, you guys had a ton of them in some of the rice fields. So really curious to see how those guys are responding. And I really like the idea of doing some different species.
Those dynamics in distribution are so hard to figure out. Like, 5-6 years ago, I had some buddies that couldn't beat the gadwalls off of them, and now you can't find one in Arkansas. So it's just these little shifts in their distribution where they're going during the winter. And I know some of my buddies in Louisiana said the gadwalls the last couple of years have been maybe down as well. Is that true? Or
yeah, I think that kind of goes for every species. Yeah. So we've been having some tough years. So
yeah, and my buddy in Alabama said the gadwalls are up. So I think winter-wise, the gadwalls might have been shifting to the east a bit, and it seems like they had more in Alabama even the last couple of years. So maybe that's where the ones. But why? What causes that? I mean, you always see these gadwalls in the in these cypress cuts, and the water's still there. Nothing's really changed. So I just wonder what little things, what environmental things, or or pressure, or what it is that really causes these little, variances in the migration from one year to the next. And those are the types of things we're really trying to. There's a whole group of people now. We're trying to. We're really synthesizing the literature on what we know about changing distributions. What species do we know have changed? Have they shifted? Have they just completely? Have they just expanded their distribution? What do we know? What don't we know? And what do we need to sort of go after to answer some of these questions? And so, we're compiling this now, and it's led by Mike Frazier out of Ducks Unlimited and a whole bunch of other people. But we're just trying to figure out what we know in science, what we don't have the data for, and what we need to go after, just to better understand just these little tweaks, like the gadwall, for instance. It's disappeared here in some of the spots that I've hunted, and it didn't appear like all that much has changed. And so
all this technology, with it being fairly new, I know you guys are getting some really cool data. And right now, I guess it's safe to say we see maybe some trends, but when will we actually have some data statistically that's meaningful? Are we looking 5-10 years down the road, or?
No, I think, we got some of the stuff on sanctuary, in terms of sanctuary on public, that stuff is really coming strong. And in fact, I may have Ethan present some of that stuff at the flyway meeting. He's getting a pile of good information out of that stuff on sanctuary use. And so we may have him. I may try to get Paul to get him on the agenda at the flyway so we can deliver some of that in February. We got some good stuff coming up on body condition in a response to the ice storm and female. It's basically targeting female body condition. Ultimately, the question I want is the female body condition in February in Arkansas, in the alluvial valley. Is that body condition here directly correlated with breeding propensity on the breeding ground? Is there some threshold of percentage of fat or protein or something in the carcass of this bird when they leave here that they need to be successful breeding on, or at least to be able to lay a nest or not? And so, how important is sort of the wintering ground to breeding? Or is it spring migrations more important to breeding success? So those are sorts of things we're looking at here. And that all goes back to the question of clean farming practices, and do we have enough energy on the ground? The DED model says we're deficient. Right? It says we're deficient of calories on the ground to support the waterfowl population that we're targeting to winter here. And so if we're really, truly deficient and the birds leave in poor body condition because we're deficient, is that impacting reproduction? And that's what we're trying to get at with some of this body condition stuff.
So that's an interesting statement, because, if you talk to most people here in Louisiana, that the first thing they say is, they're short stopping the birds and they're feeding them up north, and all the issues that go with that. But if I understood you right, you're saying that portions of your area are in a deficit to be able to carry the ducks that are coming down.
Well, this is from statistics. This is from models that tell us how many calories we need on the landscape, and there's a lot of limitations to that model. We know there are, and we're trying to refine it consistently trying to refine it to get a tighter and tighter and better estimate. But right now, the way the models read is that Arkansas is deficient by several million duck energy days.
Wow.
To support the population that we have. Yeah.
And I think I can't prove this, Doug, and I know it's kind of what you just spoke of. You're trying to prove that out, but I think that's affecting our recruitment quite substantially right now. And I think it's also increasing a wider wintering distribution of mallards. And it's part of what's kind of hurting things right now is that. And you take like last year, Casey and I talked about this a lot. It was a dry fall. Everybody got the crop out. Everybody went to pulling levees and working ground. Several guys said, man, we're ready to go next spring. All we got to do is float it and drill it. We're ready to go.
Yeah.
What's that leave as far as residual food opportunities? There's no stubble in the field to increase the bug bloom. There's no waste grain left over. There's nothing. I think long run, when you start adding that up, that's getting to be a huge, huge issue. And it's also why the big private landowners that manage well and use some food plots and try to take care of the ducks, why they're holding more and more ducks. And I think that's also kind of leads into the movement you're seeing. They're staying really tight to where they got groceries.
Yeah.
Well, and I think also Doug mentioned this in our last conversation, and I've heard it from almost every guest that we've had is, we're fighting this global warming thing that some of us believe it, whether we fully accepted it on the level it's being presented. But when you talk to a guy that's come from Illinois like Doug has, and I think you mentioned last time that everyone says the ice doesn't persist more than a couple of days. And if the ducks know the food's there, they don't have to leave. Tell me a little bit more about your own hunting in that area, Doug, and talk about the weather again. Whether we accept it or not, you don't have the ice you used to have.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to refer to it as climate change and not warming, just because everything's changing. The patterns of rainfall are shifted somewhere else. The temperature is not necessarily warming, and in terms of locally, my mother-in-law, it's 80 degrees in Pennsylvania today. I thought it was global warming. Well, what do you expect it to be? 95? Like things are changing. The storms on the ocean, the Gulf, and all that stuff, everything's changing. Sea levels changing. So we know it's changing. I know it's changing. As a kid, once the ice hit, that stuff stuck around, and ice and snowfall, right? You got ice on the water. You got the fields covered in snow. Where are the birds going to eat? If you have ice and no snow, they can eat, they can feed, they can hang out for a while. And that's what they're not seeing. They don't see the snowfall in Illinois. My mother still lives in the same town that I grew up in, and they don't see the snowfall that they do when I was a kid. And so it doesn't stick around as long. Snow will melt 3-4 days later. The birds can hang out. It's an energetic thing. At some point, is it more costly to migrate and leave this area and go look for food somewhere else, or just to hang out for 4 days because I know where the food's going to be and I'm safe here. I'm not getting shot at. I know, and so there's that trade-off and decisions that they have to make. And so, it's real. And so that's why we had such an impact on this storm that we had down here in South Arkansas and Louisiana and this part of the country, is because we had snow cover and ice for an extended period of time. And birds just don't need to migrate from Louisiana. Where else is there to go south? You can't. And so, it was a big deal. And so, I think that the climate is most definitely, and you need to talk to Mike Schumer on the climate out in New York. That's what he studies, migration and climate. And y'all probably talked to him before, but he's the guy to go to on climate. But for sure, the climate and the lack of snow, or the ice and the ice and the lack of snow now in the Midwest is definitely, it's not heated ponds, it's just the ice doesn't last as long and the snow doesn't last as long. So, I mean, it's obviously having an impact. And those seasons go out, the season goes out a little bit. And then there's a lot less hunters scattered across the Midwest than there are concentrated in the valley. And so if I were a mallard duck that lived a couple of hunting seasons and figured out where I was getting shot at, I would do my best to stay up north too, because I know how good a shot you all are.
Well, guys, we've already been an hour into this thing. It sure did go by fast. Kaysen, you got something, Jim, y'all want to add to this before we wrap up?
Yeah, I was going to tie something together there real quick. We mentioned a few minutes ago the big movements in fall migration. We talked about white fronts and mallards, and we're seeing the same thing with both species. I mean, when they get ready to leave, it's like the switch goes off. They know where they're going. They're going to come to Bald Knob Refuge. The white fronts are going to come to Northeast Arkansas, and it's the same each time. It's not an accident. They know what they're doing. But an interesting thing, and it kind of I think comes back to what you just mentioned with snowfall. We've seen now a couple of years in a row with white fronts, they will pass over all that country, land in Northeast Arkansas, get settled, maybe rebuild some of those fat stores, and then they will, I guess, sample their way back north. Because a couple of years in a row, we've had a white front killed in Indiana, Illinois, somewhere that we don't typically think about white front spending the winter. So I guess kind of my question is, since we've got less energy on the ground in Arkansas, we know we've got less habitat in Louisiana. Now we've got less snowfall north of us. So we've got an abundance of food north of us. We're seeing that sample. We're seeing, like you just said, if you were a mallard, you'd stay up there, right? So how do you feel? What's your opinion? Do you think the resource is in a good state right now, or are we in a state of change?
The food resource or the bird resource? I think both. I don't think, I think the bird resource is changing. It's adapting. These birds are adaptive, right? They have to. Look at the dry prairies right now. They fly up there. They go to that spot where they think there's water, and they're like, oh man, there's no water. And now I got to turn around and go back south. And they're adapted. They got to change. And so I think that's what they're doing down here. I think the resource itself, the food resource and the water availability and the landscape has changed to the point where it's probably impacting the dynamics and the distribution and where these birds settle for winter. So, you just think about the white fronts, historically on the coast of Texas and urban sprawl, drought, the rice goes away and they plant other crops. The birds have to move. They end up in a Grand Prairie, the Grand Prairie and all through the valley. And I think the farming practices are obviously as clean as they've ever been. And that's probably not helping. And so, and the white front population has been growing. It may be kind of stable the last 3 years, but it was growing there for a while, pretty good rate. And so likely because of the expansion into the valley and more food resources available. But if there's no snow on the ground, these things are known to spend a lot of time feeding in cornfields and during spring migration. You don't get a lot of reports of white fronts feeding in corn all that much during fall, but of course they end up down here and there's not a ton of corn for them. So, but on our body condition studies in the past, Ethan Massey did his research on this. He works for Ducks Unlimited now out of South Carolina, but he studied the white fronts and they showed up in Arkansas. They hammered the rice. I mean, they spent over 80% of their time in rice fields for the first, 20, 30 days down here. And their body fat increased, 60%. And then they got it to a certain point, and then they just slowly all winter, the body fat just went back down. So when they arrived in Arkansas in the fall, and when they left in the spring, they had about the same amount of body fat on. And so they got here, they built their fat, they hammered that resource. They're the first birds on the landscape down here, other than teal that buzz through and some early pintails. And their strategy as an early migrant is to, hit that food hard while it's there, store that extra fat, and then just loaf for a while, and then just slowly lose that fat through winter. And then at some point they can, y'all hunt them and they convert over to feeding on a bunch more greens in the fields and that sort of thing, where they're trying to build more protein. But, that fat store, that strategy for their ability to store fat early, if that ice storm would have hit in December or January, the white fronts had enough body fat on there to survive. And I think mallards do that to an extent, but they don't put on as much because there's so much, it seems like they're maybe so much more mobile than white fronts when they're down here. But anyway, yes, I think the landscape has changed on the wintering grounds, and I think it's probably causing some of the dynamics in their distribution and all that stuff to change. Sorry.
Well, Doug Osborne, you've been a wealth of information again. Man, you're obviously going to have to be another guest here on another episode again. I'm sure we'll get you back. I know Jimbo and Casey's got some more questions, but we've already exceeded our time limit again with you. So we certainly appreciate everything you're doing. And I know we talked about this last week, turning out some great students that are going to be a big benefit to the world of waterfowling. So thank you for all that you're doing up there in Arkansas. Again, we got to thank the guys at Express Boats for giving us a platform to talk about the state of waterfowl. It's going to be an interesting year to see how all this plays out. And, Doug mentioned a lot of the issues I don't think we gave the freeze credit for what all the damage may have been done. We don't have an evaluation of that last February. We got a big drought on the prairie coming up. So as waterfowl managers, it's a key time to stay tuned in on what's going on. And we know all these things are cyclic, and hopefully we're just going through one of these and things, there are going to be better days ahead, but we want to make sure to manage the resource while we're in a downtime. And it certainly seems like we may be headed into one of those seasons. So Jim, glad you made it back safely from DU in Fort Worth. Casey, get back on the farm. I saw some Instagram stuff. You were doing some really great stuff with your moist soil management and planting a little food plots there. It looked really good on Instagram. And if you guys want to follow Doug Osborne, you can go check him out on Instagram at Osborne Lab. So thank you guys for being here. Again, thanks Express Boats, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Be sure to invite your friends to listen, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We all want to know what is the state of waterfowl.